Hello and welcome to another in our series of expert podcasts in UNESCO's Inclusive Policy Lab. You may have caught some of the earlier episodes in this series, which have been looking from various angles with the competence of a range of great experts with different kinds of approaches on the post-COVID reset, as the phrase goes. The point being, of course, that the idea of a reset implies a more equitable and inclusive path than the one that was followed up to December 2019, using the information that pandemic management has given us about what the vulnerabilities and inequities and inequalities and unsustainabilities within our societies are. As always, we'll try to have a conversation that deals both with concrete policy measures that our experts have seen as being conducive to such an equitable recovery, including obviously things that have actually been tested in the real world in 2020. And secondly, the data and the knowledge that we need, or perhaps that we already have, that could inform policy shifts. Our expert today is Anders Fremstedt. Hi, Anders.
Hello.
Anders is an assistant professor in the economics department at Colorado State University. His research focuses on the political economy of the environment, especially the sharing economy and the climate crisis. Anders has written on the distributional impact of carbon pricing policies, carbon dividends, and the connections between these and universal basic income. And these are the areas of Anders' expertise that I'd like to put at the core of our discussion today. So, Anders, thank you again for agreeing to be a guest on the Inclusive Policy Lab podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, first of all, this question of carbon taxes and carbon dividends, which indeed a previous podcast, which I moderated a few weeks ago, touched upon from a somewhat different perspective. What's really interesting about it, of course, is the fact that it connects the question of a green transition, so the sustainability path post-COVID, with the question of social justice, the inclusiveness of the post-COVID path. So I'm really very interested to hear more about your ideas on how various ways of taxing carbon or drawing on some approach to the externalities of carbon in the global economy could provide a basis for a more equitable agenda for post-COVID recovery. What's your, as a first question, what's your view in general terms of carbon taxes, and in particular, something that's often raised in public discussion in this regards, the possible regressive aspects? Is carbon taxation just basically a middle-class fantasy that will end up hurting the poor, to put it in the kinds of polemical terms that one finds on social media? What's your view on that?
Well, like most economists, I support carbon pricing. I think it's a good idea, but we do need to be very conscious of its regressive nature in a country, in most developed countries, certainly the United States. I think it's helpful to think about specific tax. So I'd like to consider a tax that I've thought about a lot, a tax of $230 per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. That's the rate that we would need worldwide today, according to William Nordhaus's model, to prevent warming of more than 2.5 degrees Celsius. So it's an ambitious price, but still probably inadequate if you think we want to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius. Still, I think it provides a sort of useful metric. So I know most about the United States. In the United States, a tax of that magnitude would increase the cost of gasoline or petrol by $2.30 a gallon, roughly, or it would increase its cost by about 80% to roughly European levels. It would increase the cost of electricity by about 50%, the cost of airfare by about 25%, and then other goods it would have relatively little impact on. Grocery costs would go up by about 10%. You know, yoga classes might get 5% more expensive, and so on. So these price increases are going to disproportionately impact low-income people. And this is a somewhat tricky thing to wrap one's head around, right? Rich people in the United States have much larger carbon footprints than poor people. According to my analysis with Mark Paul, people in the richest income decile pollute about 5 times as much as those in the poorest income decile. But while that's the case, rich people still spend a smaller share of their income on really carbon-intensive goods like gasoline and electricity, right? Increasing the cost of gasoline and electricity disproportionately burdens people who spend a larger fraction of their income on electricity. So Mark Paul and I estimate that the effective tax rate would be about 50% higher for people in the poorest decile in the United States compared to people in the richest decile. So it's not a hugely regressive tax, but it is a regressive tax. And I think that's been one of the biggest reasons that it's been hard to sort of build mass support for this sort of policy, right? Everyday people are very sensitive to the prices of energy products, and they don't want to see those go up. It feels and is, to some degree, just unfair.
Yeah, that certainly speaks to anyone living in France, where, as you probably know, the question of fuel taxation in late 2018 produced a very major social upheaval that was largely driven by this perception that people who couldn't afford to do without a car were being punished for that, whereas rich urbanites who didn't even need a car were getting a free ride. And you can always argue that it's more complex than that, but that was certainly how it was politically framed, and successfully enough for the French government in that case to back down. And there have been similar examples in many other countries, including developing countries, where the question of fuel prices is often extremely socially sensitive. One obvious, I know you have technical solutions that are more ambitious, better constructed, that we'll come to in a moment. But one obvious response to that is, can't you make it both fiscally neutral and neutral in terms of progressive versus regressive by offsetting the carbon tax against other existing taxes that, for whatever reason, it might be desirable to reduce anyway? In other words, not adding tax, but shifting the burden of tax towards a recognized important externality. Of course, it depends what tax system you have. Where you have high VAT levels, as in Europe, it's easier to reduce VAT to compensate for a carbon tax than when you don't have high VAT levels. But before we get into carbon dividend, which we'll discuss in a moment, what are your thoughts on the mechanics of neutrality, or at least compensation within standard tax tools?
Yeah, I mean, that has been the approach that, at least until recently, I think was the dominant approach among economists, right? That we should tax this negative externality and use that revenue to cut other quote unquote distortionary taxes. In general, the proposals I see, I mean, the United States doesn't have a VAT and so on to cut. So I mean, most of the taxes that have actually been, we've really discussed cutting, have tended to be fairly progressive taxes. So replacing, of course, even slightly progressive tax with a regressive tax is not going to win, I think, over a lot of people in the lower and in the middle class of the United States. But in countries where you have a VAT, I think that might be a more reasonable sort of possibility. I still think it's unlikely to be as progressive as, for example, lump sum payments in the form of a carbon dividend.
Okay, so I'd like to hear more about that. How would you see carbon dividends working, both to ensure the environmental benefits of the scheme and correct its potentially regressive features? What's the big idea first, and then what are the mechanics? How would this actually be implemented?
Yeah, well, I would stress first sort of a strong ethical case for carbon dividends. So the whole point of pricing carbon dioxide is that we want to internalize the cost that we're all imposing on current and future generations from our carbon emissions. Economic theory suggests that having all firms and households pay the same price for the use of our atmosphere, the carbon sink, is the most cost-effective way for us to reduce our use of that sink, right? It's the most cost-effective way for us to reduce emissions to any given level. Also, though, since we own the atmosphere in common, right, none of us was born with a greater claim to the atmosphere than anyone else, justice sort of demands that the revenue created by pricing the use of this shared asset be shared equally with everyone. So I think first there's just sort of a strong ethical case for thinking about the problem in this way. If we return to my example of a tax of $230 per ton, right? If we tax carbon at that level, increasing gasoline prices by 80% and electricity by 50% and so on, that would raise enough revenue for us to provide every man, woman, and child in this country a dividend of about $2,200 per year, or about $180 per month. Since the rich have much larger carbon footprints, right, they're going to end up paying more in taxes. And of course, these are all indirect payments. You're not going to get the carbon tax in your tax bill at the end of the year. We'll tax everything at the mouth of the mine and at the wellhead and so on. But those price increases mean that ultimately consumers are going to bear the brunt of the cost of this policy. So the rich are going to end up, right, paying more of those price increases than the poor. Mark Paul and I estimate that if you took all the revenue raised by a carbon tax and gave it back to people in equal lump sum payments, about 62% of Americans would actually see their purchasing power increase. They would actually be able to buy more things after the policy than before. And that includes 84% of people that are in the bottom half of the income distribution. So it overwhelmingly benefits sort of people who are already spending less money, burning less fossil fuels, and so on. And I think that could make this sort of policy politically tractable. So just to give you a sense of the magnitude, for the average person in the poorest decile, right, that person would receive a dividend of $2,200 per person. Right, a family of 5 would see, over $10,000, over $12,000. They would see their costs increase per person by about $800, and so per person they would have a net benefit on average of $1,400 a year. They would be that much better off. Meanwhile, someone in the richest decile would also receive the same dividend of $2,200, but their costs would increase on average by about $4,700. So they're net losers under the policy, and they would see their purchasing power decline by about $2,500. So the intuition is, right, even if you have a somewhat regressive tax, if you take that money and rebate it to people in equal payments, you can generate a sort of progressive transfers that help more people than they hurt, precisely because the well-to-do are disproportionately contributing to the system. They're the ones who own the biggest cars, take the most international flights, and live in the biggest homes, right? So of course they are the ones that are contributing disproportionately to our climate crisis.
Okay, thanks. Those figures are very striking, and of course, I was initially going to object that the figure sounded very low, but then you made clear it was per person, not per household. So of course, it adds up very differently. I know you're talking here about the U.S., and that's where you did the detailed calculations. Are you aware of calculations that in, say, the very different environment of Europe, which has a much higher base of energy costs, much higher existing energy taxes, and often different tax and social provision systems? Is the picture potentially very different depending on the baseline, or do you find the same kind of general picture that, to put it very simply, about 2/3 of people are net beneficiaries, about 1/3 are net losers, and the 1/3 of net losers are in the highest bands of the income distribution? Again, so summarizing very crudely what you said. Does that hold in different kinds of energy and tax systems?
So I think the conversation in Europe is somewhat complicated by the fact that a bunch of the fuel taxes that Europeans pay are sort of, they're roughly actually the magnitude that I'm talking about implementing this carbon tax in the United States. So there's a lot of debate in Europe about when you pass a carbon tax, about whether or not you can get rid of other sorts of taxes, right, on fuel and so on. So I think that complicates it a bit. But in general, the structure of the problem is similar, where, I mean, well-off Europeans also have larger homes and drive cars and take more flights and so on. And so the basic outcome is still more or less the same. It gets a little bit, I think it gets a little bit more different when we move to developing countries of the global south that we might come to later. But the basic structure in Europe is similar to the United States. I think, when I say 62% of people would benefit from the policy, you have to remember there's a lot of people there that are just barely benefiting, and on the other hand, just barely losing from the policy. So I wouldn't take, that estimate too too seriously. It's obviously very sensitive to different assumptions and so on. But studies in Europe do find, relatively similar results in that respect.
Yeah, thanks. That's a good point. I suspect it's a politically important figure, though, because at some point, if this is to be done, someone basically needs to win an election running on a platform to do it. And the ability to say 2/3 of you are going to gain from this is a powerful statement, as against, for most of you, it won't matter, but some of you might gain, and so on. It's the clarity of political discourse is sometimes important. We'll come on in a moment to the connection with the idea of a universal basic income, which is obviously very compatible in spirit. But before that, another possible objection comes to mind, which is common to all taxes on bad things. If the carbon tax is designed, among other things, to promote structural change in the energy system towards greater efficiency, then the better it works, the more it will tend to erode the tax base. Does this introduce any kind of structural instability into the system, seen not environmentally, because of course in those terms reducing the tax base is good news, but in terms of the social benefits associated with it?
No, absolutely. Any revenue we get from taxing carbon, we should see is, if we actually succeed in saving the planet and addressing this crisis, of course that revenue is going to disappear to zero over the next 2-3 decades. So absolutely, I think we should see these revenues as sort of something we can use temporarily as we transition to a zero carbon economy. But you're absolutely correct that it's unlike a VAT or some other revenue source. It's not something we can rely on forever. Although for the next decade and a half or so, we might be raising substantial amounts of money. And I think that's one of the most important things, right? Economists are often focused on, we just need to get the marginal prices, the marginal costs sort of correct so people allocate resources efficiently. But we're talking about huge section of the economy that's going to be distributed differently with one of these policies. And so really, I think what I and other sort of proponents of carbon dividends are looking at is not just about the efficiency, but also what we do with that money, right? A tax of $230 per ton raises roughly $1 trillion of revenue in the United States. And that's a lot of money. So a lot of the political debate is necessarily about what you do with $1 trillion, as opposed to simply, did you get the price right, or are people abating emissions efficiently, and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I totally agree. I mean, I was partly devil's advocate saying what I said, that the question of creating a viable medium-term path to transition is really the horizon we should be talking about. 30, 40 years down the line is in any case beyond the horizon of technological innovation. All sorts of things could happen in that time, but the next 10, 15 years within the current infrastructure cycle is the time when leverage needs to be found for a path change to reduce the path dependency we currently have. So finally, I suppose the other possible, it's not an objection, but it's a different way of thinking about it. The option of taking the revenue from the carbon tax and distributing it to people in a certain way, a radically egalitarian way in this case, could be contrasted with a different approach, which tends to come naturally, I think, to many people in Europe, certainly, which is use the revenue as a lever to drive technological change, which will produce better energy systems. So, for instance, use carbon tax revenue to subsidize renewable energy, for instance, maybe to subsidize research into a new generation of nuclear power, or whatever may be your preferred option. Do you have arguments from the economic perspective that would go in the direction of saying that might not be the best way of using the revenue compared to the alternative which you're proposing? Or is this more a political choice about what kind of transition we want?
I think it is largely a political choice, right? Of course, government is necessary in creating a bunch of the new technologies that we're going to need to address this crisis. I think the question is, we should be funding that research and innovation regardless. I think the question is, do we need revenue from the carbon tax to fund it? And I think my main objection to the idea, I mean, once you have $1 trillion, of course, people have all sorts of ideas. Politicians have all sorts of ideas of what to do with it. But I think one of the important things to understand is if the idea of pricing carbon makes sense, if it does provide a decentralized solution to get people to abate emissions when they can be done cheaply, and to get people and firms to research new technologies that would allow you to do so in the future, right? If you believe carbon pricing can really work to transition a market economy away from fossil fuels into a zero carbon future, then we don't need to use the money to, the government doesn't necessarily need to spend that money on research itself, right? Or I guess often what I hear is like, oh, well, we can only pass a really low carbon tax, but if we put that money into research and development, we can maybe increase our efforts. My general perspective is I think you're asking for too low of a carbon tax. I think if you believe pricing can work, we should make the price, significant, $230 a ton, even more if we want to really reach our climate goals. And I tend to think that, at least in the United States, which is where I understand the politics best, I think, that politically it's going to be important for that money to go back to individuals in the form of a carbon dividend, and that the other monies that we need for government investment in technology should be raised, in other areas of the tax system.
Great, thanks. By the way, you mentioned that the figure of $230 a ton was consistent with a temperature increase of 2.5 degrees over pre-industrial levels. The Paris Agreement commits to 2, and if possible less, but let's just take 2. How much does the carbon tax need to increase over 230 to be consistent with a 2-degree target on the same assumptions otherwise?
Well, I think those models get less and less certain. So, I mean, we can crunch this stuff, and this is not my area of expertise, but people like Bill Nordhaus and so on can try to crunch these numbers at much higher prices and so on. But it gets really hard because we don't know. I mean, Europe right now kind of taxes fossil fuels at something like $230 per ton, which gives us some idea, in the long run, if we did the same in the United States, in the very long run, you can imagine the U.S. getting to maybe European level carbon footprints and so on. But it gets much harder to think, what does it mean to tax carbon at $500 per ton or $1,000 per ton? Raise the price of gasoline from $3 a gallon to $13 a gallon. Well, it gets challenging. So I think I use $230 because it's an order of magnitude higher than most policy proposals in the United States today. But you're absolutely right. It is still inadequate, right? And I think it's important for people who are talking about pricing, who really want to do something about climate change, to be very clear about the sort of prices we're talking about. And I'm open to the idea that $230 is too little, but right now most of the debate is looking at prices so much less than that I think we often miss the point.
Absolutely. $40 is still something that turns up in policy papers, for instance. Absolutely. So distributing $2,200 a year to every adult and child in the US sounds very like a universal basic income. And in effect, it is, at least mechanically. Is that how you would like to describe it? Or would you see this as being something different from ideas for a universal basic income? If so, what are the differences? And if this is a universal basic income, how do you respond to the very classic objections about disincentives to work and so on that are often addressed to UBI schemes, and the symmetrical objection coming from the other side of the political spectrum, that de facto such schemes will simply work to undercut wages by subsidizing substandard employment, and therefore end up taking away with one hand what's been given to working people with the other. So those are two very different, almost opposite objections, but both of them are made in the political debate. How do you respond to either or both?
I think you're right. We can see a carbon dividend as a sort of universal basic income. I think the moral case for UBI is similar to the moral case for a carbon dividend. To some extent, we all have a right to the income we all generate together on this planet. The objections that you note that people have UBI, and I do hear these objections, it's going to disincentivize people to work or subsidize low wages. I don't see those as particularly compelling objections myself. I mean, a UBI disincentivizes work much less than most anti-poverty programs that impose sort of high implicit marginal tax rates on poor and working class people in a bunch of countries. And while I think a UBI could to some degree subsidize low wages in a relatively competitive labor market, it shouldn't. Little of that should be captured by employers. So I think the strongest objection to both a UBI and a carbon dividend is actually that we're talking about huge amounts of money that the government could otherwise use for some other purpose. And it's not necessarily the case that the best thing for the government to do is to give it back to people in equal payments. That said, I mean, I am interested in both carbon dividends and universal basic income.
Yeah, I think that's a very good bridge to what I wanted to say next, which is precisely that, the old joke about not playing one club golf, which was supposedly made by the former British Prime Minister Edward Heath about monetarism. But two club golf, carbon dividend UBI is maybe not good enough either. Maybe we need a whole full bag of golf clubs to play with. In which case, the question arises at both ends, and you already pointed to both aspects of that question. Maybe we can go into it in a bit more detail. If you are setting up any kind of UBI scheme for the basically citizenship-based reasons that you were referring to, recognizing common citizenship through an equal payment that represents a non-trivial but not exclusive part of people's income, then there could be other sources. So carbon dividend could be one. Designed to decrease over time as the economy is decarbonated. And the immediate question could be, well, what other sources might make sense in something like the same normative structure? Other kinds of things that could produce a steady stream of income that could be redistributed in this way. And then the other side is the expenditure side, as you just said. The revenue raised could, instead of being distributed to people as purchasing power, be invested in things like education, for instance. And there are obviously complicated arguments as to the benefits of spending on public goods or simply giving the public the money to spend themselves. So I realize that's a very complex, multidimensional question, so I'll let you pick how you want to approach it. But looking at it both from the revenue side and from the expenditure side, what comments would you like to make on that?
Yeah, well, I would start by just emphasizing that a carbon dividend is unlikely to provide for most of a UBI, right? So in the United States, Andrew Yang's freedom dividend, promising adults $1,000 a month, right? That would require, almost $3 trillion in new revenue. It's almost as much as all federal tax revenues that we currently have, and about 5 times as much as we'd raise from a carbon tax of $230 per ton, which is already a much higher carbon tax than any serious proposals in the United States. So the other thing to remember from a carbon dividend is that money is being raised in a somewhat regressive way. So even if you're in the poorest decile, so you're the people who are going to most benefit from a carbon dividend, the actual net dividend is only about 2/3 of the full dividend, right? Because 1/3 is just going to cover the extra costs you're going to have. And as you move up the income distribution, that the net dividend gets smaller and smaller. So by the time you're talking about the middle quintile in the United States, most people they're just coming out slightly ahead. So their real net dividend would be 1/10 of the carbon dividend. So I think a carbon dividend is probably, at least on the order of magnitude I'm thinking about for a carbon price, is going to provide a small share of the funding that we need for a substantial UBI, of say $12,000 a year, $1,000 a month per person or per adult. There's some, I tend to think that, at least in the United States, where children and have much higher rates of poverty than adults, that in the United States, I like the idea of including children in these sorts of payments because there is so much poverty among children in the United States. But if you open up to other possible funding possibilities for UBI, I think the real spirit of UBI, I think it should be funded largely through progressive taxes. Not regressive taxes, right? Through a progressive income tax, or a tax on a higher tax on capital income, or a wealth tax, or a financial transactions tax could do part of that, right? But when you think about sort of the order of magnitude of the problem, Yang's UBI would require something like 15% of GDP to provide people with that sort of support, $1,000 a month. That's nearly half of capital's share of all in the economy, right? So my preference would be try to fund it from something like that. Try to figure out how is it that we can, tax those who earn high incomes based on what they own as opposed to what they do each day, right? And increase, our taxing of capital. That's something, of course, that we've been moving away from in the United States and much of the West for decades now. But I think that would be the strongest sort of basis for funding a UBI in the global North.
You didn't mention land, and the idea of a land tax as the basis for social justice is probably the oldest idea in this area, going all the way back to Ricardo. Is it just that you skipped it because you mentioned quite a few other things, or is there any reason not to include it, potentially at least, subject to political feasibility and so on, in the discussion package?
Oh, absolutely. I would see in the United States, there are not a lot of prominent proposals to tax land, but absolutely that is one part of capital that's very easy to see that should be taxed for ethical reasons, right? That if we own this planet in common, then having some people earn enormous amount of income off their ownership of the land is somehow it feels wrong. And so taxing something like that to provide everyone with some common shared ownership, I think would be nice. But we are talking about, if we were going to fund a substantial UBI, we'd be talking about taking essentially half of the income that people earn off ownership of capital, ownership of land, and so on, and putting that towards a UBI that benefits everybody.
Not a trivial political issue, but that we knew from the very beginning. Again, with a French lens, but I'm sure you looked at this at the time. There was one candidate in 2017 who ran on a platform that included, among other things, a UBI scheme, though probably at the time at below subsistence level, so a sort of gesture towards a UBI scheme. Benoit Hamon, the candidate of the Socialist Party, and he received the lowest socialist share of the vote since 1969. Not necessarily because of that particular policy proposal, but it certainly threw cold water on enthusiasm among politicians for pitching this to the electorate. But maybe with the pandemic, its time has come. And that's something I wasn't planning to discuss, but I'd just like to ask for your views on this. One of the striking things in 2020 is how many governments, for purely pragmatic reasons, have actually improvised UBI schemes in various forms. Even governments that would probably, on ideological grounds, have completely rejected the idea. Does that perhaps create fertile soil for this debate to move forward?
Well, currently in the United States, there's, of course, a huge political debate about whether or not we did get one lump sum payment back in April, May, about whether or not to do that again. And, it's not clear we're going to get another payment in the United States, but I know in many countries there have been sort of a universal basic income during COVID. And I think it makes I think that's one of the best possible policies to adopt during COVID. And I think you're right. It has been popular with the American public, and I think with the public of most countries that have received these benefits. And it could absolutely boost support for UBI going forward. I think, the debate is really going to be about whether or not it is better to give people cash than it is to give them other sorts of services. And so in the United States, there's just a very clear tension between, if the government were to get another $3 trillion in revenue, should that be given to everyone on an equal basis, or could we have things that other social democracies take for granted, such as, free higher education, tax-funded health care, child care, vacations, and so on. I think there's a compelling case for a bunch of those social democratic goods as well as just cash in people's pocket. And that, I think, ultimately that is a political decision. But I think you're right that people responded positively to the payments they got during COVID, and those were really survival checks, and they helped people survive, and people understood that to survive in a market economy requires you to have cash, even if you can't go to work, right? And UBI is one way of doing that.
Yeah, and if all of this opens a space for the kind of discussion on the nature of a public good, even though there might be different judgments about the relative balance between education, health, culture, direct income support, and so on, it's maybe precisely the right space within which you would want the debate to be taking place. And then there will be legitimate technical and ideological disagreements about it, and the balance will differ from country to country. Which leads me to another question. We've been talking in a rather North Atlantic way about the US and about Europe, because you're an expert on the US and I'm sitting here in Paris. But of course, particularly from a UNESCO perspective, the world is a lot bigger than that. And any discussion about carbon pricing, carbon taxation, basic income, or any of the other things we've been mentioning need at some level to work in South America, Africa, the Arab world, South Asia, and so on. I know this isn't your area of specialist expertise, but based on what you know of the literature, of what other experts have been doing in this area, how feasible are these kinds of ideas in India, Nigeria, Brazil, or any of the other places where social justice is really at stake? Because it's a lot of people, a lot of vulnerable people, and in systems that have often, in terms of social justice, been going backwards in recent years.
Well, I think so. If we focus on the carbon dividend for a moment, in the global north, a carbon tax is a relatively regressive tax. And much of the global south, a carbon tax can be somewhat progressive, or at least flatter and so on, making it, for distributional reasons, in some ways, a nicer tax, right? It's a somewhat progressive tax that falls largely on well-to-do, upper middle class and affluent people in these societies who do own, largish homes and drive automobiles and so on. And you could take that revenue and share it with the entire swath of population, including many people who don't own cars and maybe don't even really rely on fossil fuels, right? Still cook and so on with wood and other sort of natural fuels. So on the one hand, I think the distributional aspects can work out well. On the other hand, I think pricing carbon dioxide emissions in developing countries is challenging, because on the one hand, the global south, right, needs a transition away from fossil fuels. On the other hand, it needs to provide people with access to clean and safe energy. And right, we actually need to expand access to energy in the global south. And so taxing it is kind of pushing against that. So I think that's a real challenge with, even just the carbon pricing idea is somewhat challenging, I think, in the global south. If you could do it, I think the distributional aspects would be somewhat more progressive than the global north. From a UBI perspective, also, I mean, any country, the more unequal the country, I think in many ways, the stronger the case for a UBI, right? It means that the more unequal income is distributed or wealth is distributed, means that you can plausibly come up with a progressive tax to fund a universal income, and it's going to fundamentally change life for the poor, while not overburdening the well-to-do. So I think there are nice things about it, but of course there are competing interests. In the global south, there's also an interest in having access to high-quality public goods provided directly by the government, and I think that's the fundamental question, right? In a country like the United States, UBI has it's really transformed the debate because it does bring together, sort of lefty egalitarians with sort of libertarian types who think the role of government should be limited. And it's possible that we're going to be able to build up sort of a very broad coalition behind it. But of course, it is, in some sense, it's a kind of libertarian solution to poverty and so on. And there are a bunch of other tested solutions to these problems as well that I think we see most strongly in the social democracies of Europe.
Yeah, that leads, of course, to the obvious question, very challenging one, both politically and technically. For precisely the reasons you indicate, some kind of global redistributive approach might seem to make a lot of sense. It may not be politically feasible. It may be technically very challenging, but one could imagine, for instance, an enhanced carbon tax in rich countries with historically high contributions to emissions, and a discounted tax in the global south with a compensation mechanism to take the add-on to cover the discount. Of course, there are global governance issues there that would be far beyond this discussion. I'm not saying this is feasible. From a purely normative perspective, do you see this as actually quite logical? It's the kind of argument that I think Thomas Bockey, for instance, has made very explicitly at the normative level. In his arguments, he was focusing more on global public health goods like access to healthcare, vaccines, and treatments, and so on. But I think it applies very naturally, and he said it himself in subsequent work, to the question of environmental justice as well. Do you have any comments on that? And that, of course, is not a libertarian approach at all.
Yeah, so we're getting further and further away from what's maybe politically feasible, but I mean, I agree that at a normative level, in the same way we are making a case for a carbon dividend on the basis of equal citizenship and so on, and a UBI is a basis on the basis of equal citizenship in any given country. Of course, at some level, we're actually all, and climate change points us out, we're all sharing this planet together, and it's not obvious that an American should receive a larger carbon dividend than a Nigerian, although a policy of a carbon dividend in every country would lead to exactly that result, right? That the Americans, since we do emit more and would continue to emit more per capita with a carbon price, it would fund a larger dividend in this country than what we get in say, Nigeria. I think there's a strong normative case for saying, actually, the way to think about this is we should all be paying, say, the same carbon price worldwide, but then everyone in the world should receive the same carbon dividend. Of course, under that policy, the vast majority of Americans would lose purchasing power, and the vast majority of people in the global south would benefit, right? And I think there's a very strong normative case for it, but of course there are political constraints.
Absolutely. And it, of course, for the avoidance of doubt, it is not a UN policy or anything of that nature. And indeed, you mentioned energy poverty very correctly. It's a tension at the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals. Sustainable Development Goal 8 is about addressing energy poverty. And at the same time, there are environmental goals that seem to go against that objective. And it's for the international community, obviously, to manage as best it can the fact that we have competing objectives, which say different things, many of them worrying about the state of our planet. Anyway, thank you very much for all of those comments. I'd like to move in closing to something that is superficially less exciting, but actually very important for the work we do in Inclusive Policy Lab. And that is the question of knowledge and data. You've referred at a number of points in your analysis of the situation in the US and of the possible implications of carbon tax, carbon dividend, to quite detailed data on household expenditure and so on, and income distributions, without which we wouldn't be able to calibrate any kind of policy to suit it to any kind of policy goal. What do you see as the key gaps in this area, perhaps including in the US, the things where we would really need to know more in order to better calibrate policy responses in this area? And then we could perhaps move to gaps in other parts of the world that could be addressed by the kinds of programs maybe that UNESCO itself is responsible for with its partner organizations.
In the United States, there's growing sort of support for something like a carbon dividend, right? Over 3,000 economists, including conservatives and liberals, signed on to the Climate Leadership Council's sort of statement on carbon dividends. And there's some, so experts are sort of coming around to the idea. I think we have much less sort of understanding of how the American public or the global public would respond to the policy proposal, and increasingly there's some research in this area. So I am working on a paper where we essentially provide people. We ask people some questions about their income, their household size, and so on, and sort of do the calculation for them to give them the sense of what a carbon tax, with or without a dividend, would look for their household budget, and ask them whether or not they support it. We and other authors are finding that indeed in that sort of situation, people are pretty open to carbon pricing, especially if they think if they're told they're gonna come out ahead, right? But showing that does not necessarily mean that in the real world, in a real political sort of dynamic, that we're going to be able to build sort of majority support. And so I think really a lot more knowledge and research is needed in sort of the political possibilities here, as opposed to just sort of, a lot of what we've been talking about is like, well, what makes sense economically, or what do we need to do for justice purposes and so on. But of course, the big problem is like what can actually get done, what is politically possible, and that's outside my expertise to a large degree, but it is what we need to think about and what we need to be doing.
That could suggest, and I think many people would probably agree, but I'm just checking if it's what you meant, that advocacy in this area has not always been as effective as it might. Perhaps because it's not been making the right arguments, not talking to the right people in the right way. Do you think there is scope for better advocacy in order to create the conditions for political change or policy change in this area? And if so, what should people who basically share the normative vision that you've developed in this podcast, how should they be communicating it to get people to share it? Any comments on that?
I mean, I think I would stress that addressing climate change is going to require us to fundamentally change our way of life, right? We're going to have to get rid of internal combustion engines. We're going to have to electrify homes. We're going to have to really change what we're doing. And sometimes, especially I think from economists and sort of wonky types, we're imagining like climate policy that could we pass something that like the people won't notice, and like that's not possible. Like we can't address this problem without people noticing it. It's going to change their life. And so the questions are, how can we change people's lives in a way that's sort of politically tractable? I think that carbon pricing is sort of a central part of how we do that in the market economy. I mean, fundamentally mispricing fossil fuels when so many of our decisions are based on the prices we face, right? My decision about whether or not to insulate my attic in this old house depends to a large degree how much it costs me to heat and cool the place. I think it's hard for me to imagine fixing my attic without pricing being part of that solution. That said, some activists and experts are starting to question whether or not carbon pricing is even the right way to go forward, right? We see that with renewed interest in a Green New Deal in the United States and worldwide, globally, right? And I think what has been powerful about the sort of the thinking and activism around a Green New Deal is they are hyper-focused on what the actual goal is, and they do not deny that it's going to transform our lives and so on. I think being honest about that is key. And so I get frustrated when Green New Deal types reject carbon pricing, saying that it can't work, it never does anything. Look at all these places that price carbon. And I think, well, yeah, but the carbon price is an order of magnitude too low. Maybe it might work at the sort of prices we need. I get frustrated with that, but I'm also sometimes frustrated with economist types who are hyper-focused on sort of the demand curves and marginal abatement curves that convince them that carbon pricing is the only sensible way to address climate, when in fact it's a policy that wonks have been pushing for decades with relatively limited success, especially in the United States. So I think we want to be open to a broad range of possibilities, and I think the sort of inherent tensions that exist, for example, that you noted in the global south, between on the one hand expanding or addressing energy poverty and addressing carbon emissions. I mean, that's a tension. It doesn't matter what your policy is. That's a tension that's going to exist regardless of whether or not you do this with market-based policy or with state investment or with new regulations and so on. That's a tension that we can't get around. And we see the same fundamentally in the United States. The distributional aspects of the problem are immense. And it doesn't matter whether or not we regulate ourselves to a zero carbon economy, or whether or not we rely overwhelmingly on government investments, or whether or not we price carbon. The distributional impacts are going to be immense, and there's no way to get around that.
It's I agree totally. It's interesting that I don't think the word jobs came up in this podcast. And of course, one of the differences between the kind of New Deal approaches, not referring to any particular policy, it's not for me to comment on national policies in that way, but there are variants all around the world, and approaches which are more about taxation and carbon pricing, is that the New Deal is trying to speak to people as workers in the broad sense, trying to talk about how a transition can create jobs, because inevitably jobs will be destroyed. But jobs are destroyed anyway, so that's not necessarily a problem. But you have to point to the capacity to create new jobs, particularly in renewable energy and related sectors and so on, and the building trade. Renovating buildings, you're referring to insulating attics. Renovating buildings is potentially a huge source of new jobs, including skilled jobs that could be very valuable to underwrite such a transition. So I'm improvising here and giving my own view to some extent, but the impression the discussion gives is that there's a kind of triangle where people can be addressed as consumers, as citizens, and as workers, in a very broad sense. Not necessarily employees, many might be self-employed, but as workers. And one of the challenges is to make sure that when you talk to them in one capacity, it's not clashing with how you talk to them in the other. In other words, the trick, if feasible, would be to align the citizen perspective, the consumer perspective, and the worker perspective. And that's something that's certainly seen from the countries I know best in Western Europe, doesn't seem to have been achieved so far. So you constantly end up with this trade-off. Yeah, as a consumer, I might benefit, but it's going to kill jobs. As a citizen, I might benefit, but it's going to destroy the economy, and so on. Or maybe those trade-offs are just so deep that there's actually no way of reconciling in one language that would speak at the same level to citizens, consumers, and workers. Again, I realize that's far too big a question to answer, but maybe you have some comments on it.
I think that's a really interesting way of framing the problem. And I think, you can see a carbon dividend as a solution to the consumer problem. We recognize that pricing carbon is going to increase costs for people, and the carbon dividend is one way to make sure that those costs don't impoverish people who are already struggling in these countries. And I think that's part of the reason, the excitement around Green New Deal is absolutely sort of recognizing that some jobs are going to be eliminated and that we're going to need huge amounts of other jobs and so on. And that maybe instead of relying on the magic of the market to do it, it's useful for the state to come in and say, okay, well, West Virginia is going to be harmed by the transition away from fossil fuels and coal. And so let's use the government to ensure that there's huge investments in, say, wind energy in West Virginia to provide people with jobs where they currently live and so on. I think pairing those two things together makes sense. And I think that can be done. Most of the calculations that I've been sharing have sort of been assuming actually that the entire burden of a carbon tax falls upon consumers. So in some ways, these have been very sort of conservative estimates about the number of people, for example, who would be better off under the policy, the net benefit for people, and so on. If in fact we're not in that perfectly competitive sort of model, right? And there are going to be some concentrated losses in certain industries, which is of course the case, then a Green New Deal type policies, I think, could help address that. And I think providing a Green New Deal, probably we do need to provide people with a guarantee as workers that if your job is eliminated due to our transition away from fossil fuels, we will help move you into another, a similarly paying job to join us in the fight to save the planet.
Great. Anders, it's been great talking to you. I think there's still an awful lot to be discussed below what we scratched, but I think we had a really great discussion. I was impressed by the clarity of everything you had to say. I hope you enjoyed it too.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on, John. It's been fun, and I learned a lot.
Thank you very much. Anders Remstad, guest on UNESCO's Inclusive Policy Lab podcast series. Thank you very much, and goodbye.